Good morning and welcome to the Point. The investigation into General Motors, the ignition switch problem that's led to perhaps as many as 13 deaths, has fallen largely to one Michigan congressman, Fred Upton, the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee. At least one national pundit suggested he would be the most important person in that investigation. This morning, we talked to him about that.
We have a responsibility. I mean, this is not a partisan issue, and nor should it be. I once chaired the Oversight Subcommittee before I became chairman of the Energy and the full committee chairmanship. My big issue then, and John Dingell set the page long before me. He was chairman of the Oversight Subcommittee as well. And your objective is to weed through the grass here a little bit, find out where there's fraud and abuse, mismanagement, whatever it is, and then try to fix it. And that's what we did with the Ford Firestone issue. That was my issue back then. That was the issue of the day. We had lots of hearings, probably hundreds of thousands of pages of documents that we went through. It was a major finger-pointing issue between these two. But we got to the bottom of it. And we said, how can we have this so that it does not happen again? And that was then the TREAD Act. And as you know this better than any probably, it was at the end of the session when we finally came to the conclusion. Remember, we had the chairman of Ford come and the chairman of Firestone, and you read about the history of these two great companies and how the founders were personal, dear friends, vacation, families, probably intermarried together. Right. I mean, all these different things. But we got to the bottom of it, and we said, how does this not happen again? And that's when we came up with the TREAD Act. It's obviously, the acronym that's with tires, and we did it. It was bipartisan. I remember going over to the Senate floor, working directly with John McCain and others, my counterpart over there, to get it so that it would actually be signed by the president with real penalties, real information sharing between companies and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, and for real malfeasance, criminal sanctions, something that had never been done before. And there was a lot of resistance on that, but we said, you know what? As a driver, as a parent, as a spouse, you don't want this to happen again. And so now, what happened? So you have that reporting, and with regard to tires, any car built in America or sold in America now since '07, you've got that tire gauge right on your dashboard. So you know if that tire, PSI is way too low. And it has saved a lot of lives, maybe even mine on this issue, because that light has flashed and saved me from a blowout on an interstate. And I know that.
I just want to be clear so people understand that stemming from that investigation with the Ford and Firestone that were explorers, if I recall, was the major issue, that the work that the committee that you and Mr. Dingell, before you have headed, came up with this requirement that new vehicles, and for those people who have just seen it and didn't realize it, that is a requirement that you now have a tire pressure warning system on the dash.
In each of your tires.
It's on each tire and each
And that was part of it. But in addition to that, the regulatory body then, NHTSA, they are to receive information. This is how you know about recalls and everything else. Because of the fines, Toyota, just 2 weeks ago now, paid $1 billion for the floor mat issue. Again, something that should have been reported early on. You remember that was the accelerator problem, and it's been fixed since then, but nobody wants to go through that. So that's what we did. So the oversight function then is identify where there's wrong, and then come back and fix it. How did we learn about Ford Firestone? It was actually in the press. It was TV reports, I want to say, in a Texas public station. How did we find out about this issue now with the steering mechanism? It was USA Today. It was their headline. I read it. How can we turn our backs on it? Of course it's a Michigan company. We know that it is. But it would be irresponsible, going back to the woman that you heard on the radio, it would be irresponsible for us to turn a blind eye to what's going on. What did happen? We're actually examining now 300,000 pages of documents, trying to connect the dots. What information was sent to NHTSA? What did NHTSA do with it? What prompted them to finally act years later? As it turns out, 2 of those 13 deaths were literally just a couple miles away from where I live. I remember reading about the accident the next day. 2 teenagers. I then also had 2 teenagers. So, we're going to get to the bottom of this. Hopefully soon. GM has vowed to be cooperative. Mary Barra came and testified. Certainly didn't have all the answers. Didn't pretend to have all the answers. A little bit lawyered up, I'd say, but she's agreed to be cooperative. They're going to issue their report to us probably in 4 to 6 weeks. We're going to continue to interview folks. With 2 engineers were, I think now are on paid leave that are out the door. But one of the things that we discovered was they knew this part was defective. It got replaced, and they didn't give it a new part number. Now, that's engineering 101. Any part. And I made auto parts as a kid. That was one of my summer jobs. I made brake parts for Bendix back then, disc brake parts. They all have a part number on them. It's in the press and everything else. They never changed it. How do you then figure out which parts were defective and which parts weren't? I mean, it just boggles your mind that they didn't do that. And obviously, in hindsight, I mean, it should have certainly been done, but who made the decision not to change the part number when, in fact, they came back with that replacement? Those are some of the answers that we're going to be seeking.
I want to go back to something you talked about the chairman of GM, Mary Barra. She did come to Washington. She did sit down in front of a committee and got some pretty tough questions from
Republicans and Democrats.
That's right, from both sides of the aisle. And one of my friends said that's got to be your worst day. When you go in to a bunch of members who are not happy about this.
Raise your right hand, because before our committee, our rules are, and that oversight, you're sworn to tell the truth.
And his assessment was that anybody in her position surely knew more than she was saying. You used the phrase kind of lawyered up. Did you, as somebody who's been through a lot of those, feel like you weren't getting the answers that you needed?
Well, we're going to get the answers. I talked to her on the phone. Actually, I want to say, last time I came up here to Grand Rapids to talk with you, I think she called me that morning on my way up to Grand Rapids. Or maybe I was going to Holland that morning, I guess it was. But she called me early in the morning. Our staffs had talked. I was here in Michigan, and she knew that I was going to ask her to testify if she didn't volunteer it. So she volunteered it first. But she doesn't have all the answers. She's a relatively new CEO, just took over just in the last couple of months for sure, but has been obviously with the company a long, long time. So we're going to find out. She did not have all the, they've made some changes for sure. New vice president for safety, and NHTSA, a relatively newcomer there as well. So again, you've got to go through lots of information over a decade of time to try and figure out why this all happened. And, we'll get to the bottom of it. And they are being cooperative, and whether she comes back or somebody else, there's certainly going to be another hearing down the road. Once we get a little bit more information, we'll see where it takes us.
It's not just in the legislative branch, because this week General Motors went to the judicial branch, and they started to ask questions about relief because of the bankruptcy and bailout that took place a few years ago, and because the bulk of the people who lost their lives because of this defect, if in fact that is what happened, happened prior to the old GM being that toxic debt being moved aside. And moving forward, they want to think about the new GM. That just sounds, as an outside observer, as something that the American public could see as bad faith on the part of a major company that got a major chunk of money to stay in business. And I know you're not a consultant for General Motors, but is that in their best interest while you're trying to get to the bottom of what happened?
It's certainly it's not a very wise PR move. And I'm not a lawyer, and it does become a lot more complicated because it is the old GM and the new GM, and this happened in between with years in between. And of course, we know that the auto industry, Chrysler paid all the money back with interest. GM didn't quite get there, but they paid a lot of it back, and the federal government now has divested itself of the stock, etc. So it is a very complicating factor, and of course, your heart really does think about these victims. We've seen them. I mean, they've been on the national news. The parents of some of them. one in particular from Georgia whose daughter took their car to the GM dealer and complained about that very thing. It's it's just stopping. And they checked it out, and then the next day she was dead. There's been a settlement there. It's been sealed. I don't know what it is either. But it's as a dad and as an American company, you say, what is it? What caused this? There are other extenuating circumstances in each one of these instances that, for a lot of families, they don't want to relive. They're 5, 6, 8 years ago too. So we'll see how this unfolds.
This is going to be one of the interesting topics as we go forward in what is going to start being dominated by an election year, but this issue is going to be there, and we'll invite you to join us either by satellite or come back up and we'll talk more. We're back with more To The Point in just a moment. Welcome back to The Point. This is an election year, but it will look somewhat different in Michigan because at least a handful of members of Congress are not seeking election at all. We continue our conversation with one who is, Congressman Fred Upton. Let me move on to that election process. All of a sudden, the face of Michigan's congressional delegation got a lot different, and we haven't cast any votes yet.
That's right.
But one of your longtime friends and a chairman of another extraordinarily powerful,
two of my longtime friends.
True, but
two chairmen.
In case of Dave Camp, two of you have been there for a long time. Chairman of the Ways and Means, Mike Rogers, chairman of the Select Committee on Intelligence over in the House. Both say they're not going to run, and longtime colleague that you served with on the Energy and Commerce Committee. And
he was there, I think, when I was born. Almost.
Well,
he was just a few months, right? And I didn't know any better.
Right. John Dingell is retiring after a long time. And by the way, Congressman Gary Peters is running for the United States Senate. He certainly hopes that is not a retirement, but he's not going to be back in the U.S. House delegation. That's a pretty big change.
Yeah, and Carl Levin, of course, is our delegation too, 36 years there. Where it hurts us is this, and our delegation, I have to say, and you've seen it firsthand, we really do work together on Michigan issues and are pretty well diverse in terms of committee assignments, leadership. We're the strongest state of any, no other state has six committee chairs.
Armed services, agriculture, ways and means, energy and commerce, intelligence. I mean, that's pretty powerful. And as you say, it's pretty broad spectrum.
No other state can match 6 committee chairmanships. And especially the way things are done. And we've got a lot of new faces now that are coming. And whether it's fighting the Asian carp, we're all involved in that, or looking out for Michigan roads and trying to make sure that there's the right amount of highway money that's coming to our state. And that was one of the things I first worked on when I came in. Thank goodness. Man, can you imagine if we didn't have what we had with these roads after this terrible winter? But all of that, I mean, we work together. We have somewhat, I guess you could say, routine delegation meetings. We learn about different interests. There's a little bit of an unwritten rule that we're not competing against each other in terms of being involved, because you've got to have that camaraderie and be able to work together. And it's going to be a big change, I'll tell you. Dave Camp and I, we're 2 peas in a pod. We're former staffers, married to great women, couple of kids, almost the same ages. Never had, neither one of us, I don't think, certainly me, but I don't think he ever had a thought that he was going to run for Congress, and yet he and I are chairman of arguably the 2 most powerful committees in the Congress, at least in the House. Mike Rogers, his life is, got a great wife, kids, a wonderful son, Jonathan, in high school. Chairs a committee, took a district that was, a little bit unsafe. I mean, Debbie Stabenow was there, Dick Chrysler. I mean, a lot of different people were there, locked up really because of the job that he's done. Raised, and it really surprised all of us. When I learned that he was going, I talked the person out of it. I said, that's not going to happen. I know Mike. He's not going to leave me. And sure enough, Mike called a few hours later and gave me the news, and I was very surprised. And I'll tell you, and you know this too, there was not another member of Congress, Republican or Democrat, that was on the Sunday shows where you'd really take the tough questions more than Mike Rogers last year, 27 times. And I don't think that he might have missed one Sunday this year, whether it's Meet the Press or, Face the Nation, whatever it might be.
Well, that committee, again, not unlike yours, but it has such a broad view because it looks at both, certainly the international threat from the intelligence agencies, but also the internal threat, and it touches a lot of different pieces. But Ways and Means, you say arguably, I'll take one step further. I would say between Ways and Means and Energy and Commerce, those are the two most powerful.
No, that's, arguably we are the strongest two committees in the House.
And that, all of these changes, all put together, the armed services over in the Senate, and all of that put together, does change the look of the delegation. The fact of the matter is that you don't get there by being freshman members of the U.S. House. You have to have some longevity, and what we're really talking about is a loss of in excess of 100 years.
Well, more than that. And the other thing that Newt Gingrich did when he became Speaker was he dished the seniority system. So back in the 80s and before, you just got reelected. If you were reelected enough, you could be 90 years old, and you would then become chairman of who knows what committee. And they were. Mel Price from Illinois. Anyway, that changed. You now compete for those, but you still have got to be on those committees. You got to know the issues. You got to know the direction of where you want to go. You got to have some interface with the leadership so that they have confidence in your ability to generate write the right legislation. Dave Camp would not be chairman had the seniority system been in place. Fred Upton, I would not be chairman. It would actually be Ralph Hall, who turns 91 in about another week or so. He would be chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee. Good guy, able guy. It's a little bit different, I think, having Upton versus Hall. But we're going to miss Dave's leadership. We're going to miss Mike Rogers' leadership. One of the things that certainly impacted Mike as it did me, and everyone that was there, was 9/11. We were there. We remember every second of that day. And for Mike, he has tried to make sure that it doesn't happen again. And that has been his whole drive, and certainly leadership in a bipartisan way, leading the Intelligence Committee and the Patriot Act, and all the things to make sure that it works, that people's rights are protected. And we're going to revisit that probably in the next month or so in terms of a bipartisan intelligence reauthorization bill that probably reaches the floor in the next couple weeks.
This may be one of our more schizophrenic conversations because we've talked about a very serious issue, which is in your committee because it is your main committee. We've talked about the politics, as we have for 2 decades, about who's running and who's not. We won't get to any of the actual election stuff until we get a little further down the road. But there is something that sometimes happens as a member of the United States House of Representatives where you have an opportunity to take an issue that is indeed bipartisan, not to mean that everybody goes along with it, but it really touches home. And you as a father, and as you were telling me this before we went on the air, I was relating it to my young children. The ability of a little girl who has since passed, lost her battle, but she spurred you and your members, your colleagues, into action to put money into pediatric healthcare research.
Yeah, this is a great story. People ought to YouTube this, GabrielleMiller.com, YouTube it, and you can see the story. But she gave Congress a challenge last year. 10 years old, had incurable brain cancer. She said, get your job done. Why don't we have pediatric research at the NIH? She did a number of rallies, raised a lot of money, and she passed away. And, in her spirit, really, because she died last fall, I want to say October, November, we passed a bill that, in fact, brings about that program to the NIH. Now, we have a system now that if you have a new funding, you got to find an offset. We found one. We said the taxpayers are no longer going to fund the Democratic or the Republican National Convention. Let them find their own sponsors. Let them, it's a big party. We know that, all the different things. Maybe it shouldn't be as long, but you know what? The taxpayers aren't going to fund it anymore. And we're going to take that $12 million and we're going to put it into pediatric research. So you might remember I was one of those that gave the response to the president earlier this year. I want to say it was in February, the Saturday morning address. And we had 4 colleagues that day. One of them was a member of our committee, Greg Harper, whose bill it was. And he said, Mr. President, we've got a lot of bipartisan pieces of legislation on a variety of different issues. We had one member for each one. I talked about pipeline safety, a number of different things. But Greg Harper said, to pass the Gabrielle Miller bill. This was a bipartisan bill that we passed with more than a 2/3 vote in the House, and it's stuck in the Senate. Help us. And we got the Senate to take it up. They passed it without a dissenting vote. The president signed it April 3rd. It's great.
This is one of the places, one of the areas where, and let's face it, there are a lot of ways that Congress has not worked well in the past. Well, you pick your period of time.
Yeah.
If you want to go decades, you want to go years, you go as far as you want to.
We can fix it.
There was a time, we talked about this late last year or early this year, when you took a 2-year look at budgeting. And that was a bit of a breakthrough. After a very contentious fall, there was this idea that let's not do this every 30 days or 90 days. Now you talk about something like this NIH, and there are other things that you want to do moving forward, particularly as it pertains to the ability of the federal government to influence positively people's health.
Yeah. We've actually this year, I think we've had more than a dozen pieces of legislation now on a bipartisan basis on health come like this Gabrielle Miller bill. We did the EpiPen, that's the allergies to peanuts. We did an HIV organ transplant bill, save 1,000 lives a year, again bipartisan. We've done a number of energy efficiency bills in the House. Senate hasn't taken them up yet. I'm hoping that they do that actually when we come back after this Easter break. But, on something like this, I mean, there's no reason why we shouldn't be working across the aisle to get things done. And one of the things we're going to do, and we're going to formally unveil it May 6th, is a faster cures agenda, where we're going to listen. We're being the Congress. We're going to listen to the pharma, so the Pfizers and the Eli Lillys and the Paragos, the Strykers, the biotech industry. We sat down with Francis Collins. He heads the NIH, and he is National Institute of Health, and he's going to be a participant with us. We're going to work with the disease groups, whether it be Alzheimer's, diabetes, cancer, MS, name it. We're going to work with all of our universities. I sat down with the dean of the Michigan Medical School. He's going to participate on May 6th, come to Washington. We're going to have an event back here in Southwest Michigan at some point, probably this summer as well, with many of our local people. But we haven't changed the formula for approving the drugs and devices to find the cures that we all want in 50, 60 years. So let's look at these advances. Let's discover what they are. Let's develop them to get them done, and then deploy them, sort of the 3Ds across the country. Because if we don't do it, who will? Well, it'll be someplace not in the U.S. Those jobs will go someplace else. And in fact, all of those diseases will not get the faster cure that we all want. We can do this. So our plan is to take really probably the next year, a lot of roundtables, some formal subcommittee hearings, and that. Let's get all these major players who can think through this, and cut this red tape, cut the bureaucracy, cut the time that it takes to get there, cut the cost. To get a drug to market now is $1 billion if it makes it. Let's work together. It's bipartisan. I've already sat down with Steny Hoyer, who's the minority whip, and Eric Cantor, the majority leader. They're going to participate in our event. They've bought into this, very much like what we saw with the Gabrielle Miller, bill that we did. And we can move forward, and we can work with the Senate, we can work with both sides of the aisle, we can work with the president. And I'm hopeful that about a year from now, after doing this listening and figuring out we can write legislation that will accomplish this goal, and then we'll move it through the Congress. And that's be one of our big lifts that I intend to see happen as chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee next year.
We'll be back with the final word to the point. This week, the state legislature will get back to work. Job one will be trying to get a budget done. Next week on our program, we'll talk to the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee and a Democratic member of that committee as well. I hope you'll join us next Sunday morning. To the Point.